Although New Testament studies for a very long time has already pretty much established that this idea that, Mark is Peter's scribe or Matthew is a tax collector, etc. Almost all historians at some point claim there is an eyewitness. You want to believe him, but at the same time, you're like, but everybody always says that. So stakes are so high for claims about the historical Jesus that's why people get really sort of fixated on the idea of like, this must be true, or he must have said this, or he, which is the authoritative account. We don't even have to go to things like talking dogs and angels. Synoptic gospels don't really even tell the same story about Jesus. Matthew and Luke have different birth narratives. All of the leaders are wrong, close to the date, but it's not quite like, so-and-so was not the governor of Syria at the time. Joseph, I don't even think would pay taxes. He doesn't appear to be a citizen. The expectations that we have for these texts were just not there in antiquity. It's God. It's God. It's God. It's God. So what I did in my book is try to start from the standpoint of not making any assumptions. Although New Testament studies for a very long time has already pretty much established that this idea that, Mark is Peter's scribe or Matthew is a tax collector, etc., was a much later designation probably the church fathers put onto these writings to make it seem more cohesive historically, or more easy to accept the idea that they were part of an oral tradition or an eyewitness account. So when I say I didn't want to make assumptions, what I'm getting at is that I was never quite sure why we assumed that would be the case, because when we talk about ancient Mediterranean literature just generally, so here I'm thinking about Jewish literature, what we might call Greek and Roman literature, and what we call Christian literature, those categories are all sort of problematic in their own ways. And so I wanted to see what would happen if I actually started to treat the Gospels the way we treat all this other kind of literature, because now all of a sudden we've opened up all these new possibilities for exploring, what's their level of Greek? Who else writes like this? Who else do we have writing in Koine, using similar kinds of vocabulary? None of these approaches are really that unique in a comparative sense in the history of the New Testament, but it's a different way of kind of giving authority back to the writer and trying to figure out what they're up to. But the other thing I tried to do was look at how did we get the methodology that we have in the New Testament, where we are doing things like reconstructing communities. If nobody else in like classics is doing this, why are we doing it in New Testament? So I tried to approach it from a new perspective and ask, what changes or what doesn't change? If instead of trying to reconstruct the Markan community or the Pauline community, or assuming anything about these authors other than what we find on the page, if we try to reconstruct these authors based on what they tell us about themselves in terms of their evident or obvious level of education, their interactions with each other, their cross references to other kind of literature, what can we say about what place they hold in society, or what their most serious influences are?
To clarify, you don't think the gospel authors were necessarily within the Christian movement. Plausibly, they were post-70 CE authors who tried their hand at a creative piece of writing motivated by what you could call imperial curiosity. These people were trained writers. But
there were a couple questions there. The first one is, I assume they're not writing about Jesus communities unless they like know one, or they're a part, like they're a part of one somewhere. Like there's a reason they're motivated. I just don't think that the thing that's influencing them the most necessarily is the Jesus community, because they're still writing in Greek, structuring what appears to be a biography, like you're saying. They're infusing their texts with references to things like the fall of the temple. So yeah, I do think that they're post-war. And you mentioned subversive biography. One thing I argue in the book is that there is an established tradition before the Gospels appear of taking a great hero, like an Alexander the Great, and telling a story where he's not just like a great warrior.
That's helpful. And you mentioned that Mark, Matthew, and John's Greek isn't incredible, and especially Mark's is sort of rough. And this could be seen as an argument against the gospel authors as elites, but I assume you would respond with an appeal to nuance, because there's a spectrum of technical ability, rhetorical talent, and elegance, even among literary specialists, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I think that the idea that there's nuance to this is really important. And, Mark, for instance, I think, maybe Greek isn't his first language. There are some indications, for example, in chapter 15, that he knows Latin. What if Latin's his first language and he's writing in Greek? What if, this is an attempt to write in Koine Greek because you don't want to write in the kind of classicizing Greek that's so characteristic of the Roman Empire? You want to write in something that's more accessible. I think that those kinds of possibilities are opened up. And again, elite not meaning like rich guys, but
Right.
elite meaning they've had enough time to go to school because they didn't have to farm for a living, or they didn't have to go into the family business, etc. Right, like somebody who's been able to go to school enough to be able to write prose is no small thing. I think they've done actually a really great job, and I think we underestimate to some degree, especially someone like Mark, just because the Greek's a little rough, but he clearly has, certain kinds of intentions for his text. He's engaging in the kind of tropes we were talking about. He's aware of all kinds of other genres of writing. You can tell he's reading a lot of stuff.
That's fair. And okay, one thing that was really fascinating to me in your book was that among the minority of ancient people who were literate, and it was a minority, even
Yeah.
then most of them were only functionally so. For example, a scribe is able to read, replicate, and perhaps interpret texts, but not sufficiently trained in paideia to write an extended narrative. In your book, you say, to be clear, or here, let me quote you, quote, to be clear, possessing enough popular literacy to interrogate a text, write a receipt, create deficienes or curse tablets, or draft a bill of divorce is not the same thing as writing literature. Authorship was a specialist activity that required significant training and skill, and rhetorical skill. That's page 124. So this is very interesting because apologists not uncommonly assert that we'd expect Mark and Matthew and Luke to be able to write in light of their professions, but that would only be functional literacy. How plausible is it to suggest that a scribe, Mark, a tax collector, Matthew, a Gentile traveler, Luke, and a peasant fisherman, John, became literary specialists later on in their adulthood?
Those are really great questions in the way to phrase it. So it's one of those things, of course, right? Like, you don't want to discount the possibility that a scribe has enough technical skill in prose composition that they could write the Gospel of Mark, right? But the problem I start to have with those kinds of theories is, you mentioned functional literacy. Like, sometimes you just went to school enough to do the thing you were supposed to do for your profession, right? So we have lots of examples where you can kind of tell a scribe maybe doesn't know what they're copying, but they know how to copy, right? Like, but you can tell they're making spelling mistakes in a way, or like kind of like they're not paying attention, and like the line is there's repetition in the line or something, where you're like, I don't know if this person could read this thing, because if they saw that mistake, wouldn't they have like stopped, or they would have fixed it. And so the problem I often have with the speculation about, like, well, maybe one's a scribe and maybe one was a tax collector, it's kind of taking like all these really exceptional hypothetical cases and trying to extrapolate from them like this larger claim that tries, I think, to keep these gospel authors within that ambit of imagined early Christian, like Jesus followers, meaning trying to map them onto the people you find in the Gospels, right? So the people around Jesus in the Gospels are fishermen, tax collectors, people who aren't particularly wealthy. So if you're going to try to make claims about eyewitness testimony, or this is reliable, or the Gospels reflect the Galilee, or the kind of people that are portrayed in the Gospels, yeah, that's really all you can do, right? Like, because the only educated, potentially literate people you're finding in the Gospels are people like tax collectors. And I feel like that's, now you've asked me to take like multiple assumptions in tandem to draw that conclusion. Like, not only do these people have to look exactly like the people in the Gospels, but they have to correspond to exactly the kind of literate people you find in the Gospels. And now you have to give me the one tax collector who can write prose literature, even though I'm not sure why you're assuming this guy's a tax collector, other than someone 200 years later told you, who might have been, because actually in the case of the Gospel of Matthew, he really knows Stoic philosophy really, really well. But if you're only looking at the Gospel of Matthew as, here's the tax collector who knows the Hebrew scriptures, that's all you're going to be looking for. That's all you'll see. So I'm trying to break the Gospels out of those kinds of structures. And also, I'm always troubled by, the Gospel of Luke tells us exactly what he's doing. He's been hired by someone to write this story. That's much more typical. And so I just try to keep us as much in the realm of what can I tell from these texts and what survives in the text itself to reconstruct the author, rather than, again, bring in all this kind of external assumption.
Interesting. And you mentioned Matthew is very familiar with Stoic philosophy. Could you could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I've mentioned the scholar before in another interview, and she's got a book forthcoming, a couple of books forthcoming, but her name is Erin Roberts. And actually, the scholar Stan Stowers has published on this already, but there seems to be a lot of technical language in Matthew that comes from Stoicism, particularly in how Jesus handles anger or talks about anger. Also, and that's what Dr. Roberts' book will be on. And then the other thing too is he's got a lot of language, oddly, about things like cosmology that tend to get overlooked because he talks so much about the Hebrew Bible or makes reference to the scriptures, and that tends to dominate how people read him. But one example is the word that gets translated as epilepsy in Matthew is actually the word for moon sickness in Greek, and he's one of the only authors to use it. So there are all these kinds of interesting terms and references to philosophy that you see in Matthew that demonstrate he's not just about citing scripture, or having this kind of monolithic approach to the story of Jesus. He's incorporating things like philosophy. Mark does the same thing. Mark uses a lot of technical terminology that also comes from Stoicism or Middle Platonism, especially when it comes to physics. So his understanding of how Jesus actually heals people with power and with the Spirit, those terms in Greek are from Middle Platonism and from Stoicism, which was a very popular philosophy in the first century. Paul, the apostle, uses the same kind of language, which suggests either this philosophy is so popular everyone's using it, or maybe Mark has read Paul. So you get some sense of kind of the interchange or exchange of texts or reading materials between these authors that way. I think Luke clearly knows the biographical tradition, and he knows the Greek novel because he has details nobody else has. He has more of like a road trip. He has that nativity story that we're all familiar with. So he's understanding that biography should be like how this great man was conceived, born, his life, and then how he dies. But his life needs to have like some travel stories in the middle of it. So it's a little bit more biography, a little more epic. And I have an article coming out soon about how I actually think Mark has been reading the epics as well. Because he uses what's called usually paradoxography, which is talking about wonder. But the way he does it is in the same way you see in Homer or in Virgil. And so when you start to get down to these kind of, I don't even think they're minute details, but these literary strategies you see the authors using, all of a sudden you're like, wait, why did I think this was a community oral tradition? Because even if some portion of this is coming from what we might call oral tradition, it's being sort of filtered through the way that writers write in the first century, making references to other kinds of popular literature, references to each other, structuring their stories in a way that correspond with what a reader might expect if they're, reading a story about a great healer, wonder worker, son of a god in the first century.
That's fascinating. Another question I had is,
Sure.
on the last page of your book, you write, quote, "But if we treat the gospel authors as authors with artistic license, we must contend with the possibility that these are writers acting as writers. This means that it is possible, even likely, that a good portion of what we read when we read the Gospels is invention or part of a broader literary tradition." End quote. So I'm curious, why do you think it is plausible that much of the gospel material is invented or incorporating Greco-Roman topoi in a distinctly ahistorical way? And again,
Yeah.
related to this, with the context, when historians read other Greco-Roman biographies, such as from Xenophon or Plutarch or Suetonius, do they similarly think that a good portion is fictional? I'm not sure because you're the classicist here, so I got to ask you.
So yeah, it's a great question, and I'll try not to get too like theoretical. So the quick answer to it is that what we consider historical is very different from what people thought was historical in antiquity, and we're super careful about like something has to be true and you have to prove it, and fiction is different from nonfiction, and we have all of these categories and these ideas about how that's supposed to work. That Those ideas are out there in antiquity, but they're not as cut and dry. Like even the concept of a genre of literature is really more of a modern construction than an ancient one. So when it came to history, and you mentioned Plutarch, who I mentioned in the book as well in my last chapter, so he's an easy one for me to go to. But I'm also thinking about some of the historians I've mentioned in this conversation, like Herodotus. So first of all, I should just kind of get out of the way that everyone accuses everyone else in antiquity of lying. Like that's kind of like the go-to because you want someone to read your version. You don't want them to read the other version. And like, particularly if you don't like someone, you're going to be like, well, that guy was lying, about this or that. And then it's easier for us to see how much what I call invention are in some of these other texts, because they'll tell us things that we just know now are completely not true, or like really stretch credulity, and some of them are really like the most obvious ones are really kind of awful, but they'll make claims about people with faces that grow out of their chest in a particular region of the world, like like basically what we would call like monstrous kind of ideas. And they can make those claims about far off places in the empire because, or elsewhere in the world, because nobody's going to go out there, nobody's going to see it. Or you can make claims about natural disasters, like, so you could make these kinds of claims, and then like someone would come along later and be like, well, that guy was lying about this, right? So those kinds of claims are out there all the time. I think what happens is we tend to give a little bit more latitude to the gospel writers than maybe we should. And this was kind of what I was getting at, because like even someone like Plutarch, when he's writing about Alexander, that's like 400 years or something, like centuries after Alexander was alive. And he did his best, and he kind of tells you like, I'm trying to reconstruct this the best I can, but he also tells us, I'm not going to try to get into like the great battles that he fought and like the this and that and like minute details of these things. I'm here to just give you an impression of what this guy was like. So I'm going to tell you some little stories that are like almost like anecdotes about this guy, and that'll give you a sense of his character, because that's why you're reading this. And many other authors would do things like this in terms of saying like Alexander was really born from like a snake. Like nobody believes that. You know what I mean? Like when it's not about Christianity and it's about another first century text or figure, we tend to understand when history doesn't really apply in the same way, and we're more
Wait,
understanding.
sorry, if I can interrupt. Interestingly, a lot of apologists say they'll point to Plutarch's biography of Alexander, and they'll say this is 400 years after Alexander died, but historians still trust this, which is a little misleading because, I heard this, and then I heard two students from Duke University say, go ahead and just read it, like read it and see if everything is clearly historical, and then on the first page, it's Alexander. There's divine conception, and then there are omens, that kind of foreshadow his birth, and like there's all sorts of fantastical things. There's history in there, but it's misleading to say historians and classicists just trust Plutarch here.
Yeah,
So
we all
yeah,
think Alexander was born of a snake. Um, like we don't, like we just don't. And so it's sort of like I try to be fair as I can't possibly can. Back to kind of the beginning of our conversation, like how can I treat these things the way we treat other kinds of literature from the same period or thereabouts? Like we're very measured in what we're willing to accept about claims about people's places and individuals when we don't have that personal investment on wanting to know like exactly what is historical. The thing that's always interesting to me, it's almost like the stakes are so high for claims about the historical Jesus that's why people get really sort of fixated on the idea of like this must be true, or he must have said this, or he which is the authoritative account, even though the gospels actually, even the synoptic gospels, don't really even tell the same story about Jesus. Matthew and Luke have different birth narratives. But we seem to hang more on that, more consequence on that, and we want those texts to conform to contemporary ideas of what history telling mean. And I don't think that the text can do that. It's kind of that square peg round hole problem, because the authors were not bound by those same kind of standards of history telling, or giving a nonfiction account of something. They really were there to kind of give you an impression of a figure, or make it more of kind of a moral or ethical story to think about, than to give you the tools to then draw longer and later theological conclusions that would have all kinds of implications for law, for etc. It's just not what was going on for these authors in the first century, and for good reason. It's very difficult to confirm any kind of story in the ancient world, because life expectancy is short. Not that many people can read. You don't have easy ways to confirm or deny any kind of claim, and so it's just the infrastructure is not there, and the expectations that we have for these texts were just not there in antiquity.
I interviewed Dr. Craig Keener, and we talked about the speeches in Acts and their authenticity, and he and Dr. Michael Licona, and from them I realized virtually all scholars agree that ancient standards of historiography are different from typical modern standards, and especially with speeches, the historiographer or the writer would try to convey some kind of moral message or their own theology, or a lot of scholars would also say the theology of their community, which you would disagree with, but they try to express that through the speeches, and Dr. Keener acknowledges that. But with respect to the reliability of Acts and the speeches in general and the Gospels in general, it comes out conservative with respect to the reliability of their accounts, and this is because a lot of conservative people say the Gospels consistently get various specific historical details right about arguments within Judaism between Pharisees and Sadducees, and peasants and elites, and bodies of water, and whether not just place names but obscure towns, and whether they're going up or down from someone, or east or west, and so on. Even like the specifics in what city officials were called, because there were lots of different names, and then archaeology confirms. And I know this is just a standard apologetic argument, but I'm curious if you agree that the Gospels get a lot of historical details right, and if so, what the implications of that are, or because from the look on your face, it seems like you deny that, and you'd say that maybe these are just like myths that consistently situate their stories in historical places.
Well, it's hard because so if you're it's always a little bit idiosyncratic to me what people decide to call historical fact versus non-historical fact. So you all, not you, but like we also are dealing with, say, in the Gospels, stories about a demon going into pigs and hurling them off a cliff, and in Acts, I mean, there's Acts of the Apostles. There are many other Acts, Acts of Paul and Thecla, for example. But in a lot of these stories, there are things like talking dogs, angels helping people escape out of prison, like these very fantastic stories. And so it's always a little strange to me. So the reason I go like, I don't know how to distinguish between like, oh, so he got Capernaum right here. But, then there's a talking dog. It's like, it's hard for me as a historian to look at those things. And I think if you're a person of faith, then you read the text as a person of faith. But again, it kind of comes down to what do you want this text to do, right? Now, it's certainly the case. I think you were probably referencing the Gospel of John, where there are some archaeological sites that are described, and then John seems to, have some kind of things have been found that, I'm thinking there about the pool
Right,
and
the pool of
John.
Bethesda.
Yeah, exactly. Which is really exciting, I think, and really, really interesting, especially because scholars tend to date John really late, right? And so there's a piece of really interesting data to contend with. I think that's fabulous, but it's also the case we can tell that John's out of order.
Hmm.
Jesus will say, "Why doesn't anybody ask me why I go to this town when he's just come from that town?" There's actually a whole bunch of different theories about why that is. There's one called the Boltzmann displacement theory, that a scribe actually tripped and like dropped the document and then like shuffled it back together and it was all out of order. So these things are like it's like endless. You can continue to argue for and against, and everybody on people on either side are going to have their claim versus the other person's claim. I mean, we don't even have to go to things like talking dogs and angels. I've been pregnant. I don't want to go on a donkey for like a 60-kilometer ride when I'm 8 months pregnant. Like, that doesn't sound like a real story to me, right? And that whole like worldwide census, we know that never happened. All of the leaders are wrong. They're like close to the date, but it's not quite like, so and so was not the governor of Syria at the time. Uh, Joseph, I don't even think, would pay taxes. He doesn't appear to be a citizen, nor was there any census that would force you to go back to your homeland. Like, all of that's just writerly stuff, from what I can tell. So I feel like that conversation would end up becoming endless. And it just comes back to that initial thing that I mentioned a couple of questions ago, which is, it's more about what we're trying to get out of the text ourselves that maybe the text can't supply, or we have to ask ourselves, why do we care? Because if you're a person of faith, does it really matter if Mary rode on the donkey or not? Right? Does it really matter whose birth narrative is correct? Does it really matter if Jesus went to particular towns or not? And isn't it exciting when something is confirmed? Because let's take that as evidence of thinking about how these texts were produced, rather than as weaponizing it for kind of having arguments with one another. So that's more or less my opinion on the matter.
All right, I see that. One more main question before we get to the brief conclusion of the video, and then and then we can let you go. Even if the traditional evangelists did not themselves pen the Gospels, what about the slightly more modest claim that the Gospels are still rooted in eye and ear witness testimony? And we've been talking about this, but specifically, this claim could take a number of forms. One could say they were dictated by the traditional evangelists. I've heard people say this. That you could suggest they were written with secretaries, and you could compare this with some of Paul's letters. You could point to patristic evidence in favor of apostolic connections, which again you've mentioned, or
Yeah.
assert that they are rooted in historical tradition because they get numerous historical details right, which I mentioned. So we've talked about a number of things, but what about the kind of core claim that they are still rooted in eyewitness testimony? And most scholars who agree with this wouldn't say it's pure historical reportage. It's historical traditions along with their own creative writing process and their literary purposes, as well as their own theology. It's the three kind of combined. And I'm curious what you think of that sort of portrait of the Gospels.
The caveat I have to give you is kind of back to all these technical historical problems we've been talking about in terms of literature, ancient literature, which is almost all historians at some point claim there is an eyewitness to whatever they're about to say. I think Herodotus does it. A lot of historians will do it even though they've never been to the place that they're about to talk about, but they'll say, I talked to an eyewitness who talked to an eyewitness who saw this thing. So the problem you run into, again, if you're sort of treating the Gospels as quote unquote normal Greco-Roman literature, is that claims about eyewitnesses, and Luke does this, right? The other ones don't, but Luke will say, thanks Theophilus, and then he says, I've spoken to people who from the beginning, were part of the word and have passed it on. That kind of preface is almost expected in a lot of this kind of literature, and so that puts you in a bind, right? Because you want to believe him, but at the same time you're like, but everybody always says that, so what do I do with it?
And
But what I would
in those cases when people do say, I've spoken with eyewitnesses, do historians and classicists consistently doubt that?
I think there's usually a healthy amount of skepticism that comes in with a lot of these claims, because usually, too, whoever's writing is trying to make themselves sound pretty good. Because they're trying to say, like, I'm authoritative because I talked to somebody who's seen it, or I've seen it for myself, but then of course when the claims are um, very fantastic, that kind of stuff we have an easier time being like, okay, so you told me there was an eyewitness because you're about to tell me something a little bit fantastic. This happens in the paradoxographical tradition very frequently, where he would be like, I talked to an eyewitness who told me a guy lived to be 730 in Thessaloniki, and that there was a woman who gave birth to a donkey in Rome, and like that, and these things didn't happen. I know that some of the paradoxographers will claim, like, oh, in the Roman temple, treasury, they have a couple of centaurs that were collected from XYZ place, and I talked to somebody who's been in there and they've seen the centaur bodies. You got all kinds of things like that, and so you have to
Could you give us a couple
temper
of names of these paradoxographers?
the one I'm thinking of right now is named Phlegon. It's
Oh,
Phlegon. So this book came out, University of Exeter Press, and I've been there's a like the Greek text is available. It's hard to get a hold of, but this is from 1996, and it was reprinted in 2010. So it's something that you can take a look at and see some of these kinds of claims, and usually they're sort of split into, I actually just opened up to discoveries of live centaurs. Right, so usually these things are accompanied by, like, I talked to somebody who saw it, there was a live centaur in Arabia, and then, like, it goes on they have a human face but they have horse hooves, and blah 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 blah, right? And so that's the thing that you have. Oh, and it's in the emperor's storehouse. Anyone who is skeptical can examine it for himself. So like, this kind of thing is out there. So that makes it hard when you're thinking about these claims of eyewitness testimony, right? Because you can see that it happens elsewhere, in other kinds of contexts. And so because we treat these things with a healthy dose of, not necessarily skepticism, but you have to be, critical, because sometimes ancient writers would do things like claim that they've made great discoveries themselves, when you sort of doubt, like, that they're responsible for it, but they want to make themselves look good. So I say all of that, but I do, again, back to, let's just talk about Luke. I don't deny that there must be some kind of Jesus movement, Jesus group. My concern is only that I don't know how to tell what is quote unquote true and what's not, for all the reasons we've been talking about in this conversation. It just makes it really difficult, once you think about all these literary tricks of the trade, to then be able to come up with a methodology that definitively tells you something is true or not. Is God